Antonia Angress is the author of the novel Sirens and Muses, which was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award and was named a Best Book of 2022 by Glamour magazine. She is a graduate of Brown University and the University of Minnesota MFA program, where she was a Winifred Fiction Fellow and a College of Liberal Arts Fellow. Born in Los Angeles and raised in Costa Rica, she currently lives in Minneapolis with her family. Sirens and Muses takes its title from two mythological figures. The sirens are half bird, half woman, with powerful and alluring voices who lure sailors to their deaths. And the Muses are the goddesses of and sources of inspiration for literature, science, and the arts. Angress's novel is not a retelling of this mythology, but the two figures serve as subtext for the book as Angress delves into the world of art making, the art market, and coming of age as an artist. Set in 2011 against the backdrop of the recession and the waning days of the Occupy Wall Street movement, the novel follows Louisa, Karina, and Preston, undergraduate students at Wren College of Art, an elite and selective art school, and also follows visiting professor Robert Berger, an artist whose brief fame is from a now contentious art piece portraying his best friend on his deathbed as he was dying of AIDS. Each character struggles to understand their place in the world and who they are as artists. For Louisa, Karina, and Preston, these questions constellate around relationships to money: who has it, who doesn't, who can afford art school, who cannot, sexuality and desire, how and if one can make a career as an artist, and if so, at what cost. Later in the novel, when Karina and Louisa have reconnected in New York, Karina says, "Money changes how people perceive things, how they react to them." She paused. "When I behold something really valuable, I can feel it in my body. It's almost erotic." Karina's remark articulates the complex web between creator, career, and commerce, asking us to consider, how do we sustain a practice of art and balance that with the sometimes antithetical practices necessitated in making art a career? Louisa and Robert both find ways to return to joy in their practice, in part because they have navigated both the sirens and the muses, leaving us to reflect who and what inspires us and what draws us in with its beauty or promise of fame and wrecks us upon the shore. Please join me in welcoming Antonia Angress.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Rachel. It is such a pleasure to be here. Over the past couple of days, I've gotten to visit several classes and talk to students, and I've just been really blown away by everyone's curiosity and the questions I've been asked. So truly, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being here tonight. I am going to read from the very beginning of my novel, chapter 1, and then I'm very excited to be in conversation with you all and hear what questions or observations you have. Chapter 1. Louisa's first assignment at Wren College of Art was paint home. She'd left home 12 days ago, and now, as she looked out the classroom window, it startled her still to see hills and sullen, huddled townhouses, the New England sky close and cold, nothing like at home where the sky overwhelmed the land, a drama of clouds and rain and strange shafts of tawny light. She'd never been on her own before. Her year at South Louisiana Community College didn't count. She had slept in her old bedroom, borrowed her mother's car to get to class, worked the same shifts at Chez Jacqueline, eaten Sunday dinner at Grandma and Pepper's. Louisa was homesick. It was normal, she told herself. Even at 19, almost 20, it was normal. And so, alone in her studio, she'd cried a little as she painted Lake Martin at dusk, bald cypresses echoed by their dark reflections in the water. It was a placid scene, but ominous, tinged with danger, curdled at the edges like a faded bruise. In the background, low, swollen clouds gleamed with uncanny clarity, and a flutter of pintails took off over the marsh. In the foreground, an ibis waded in the shallows, its bow-shaped beak slicing through the water. Its plumage was a soft, unglossed white, except for its black wingtips. Its pearly blue eye met the viewers. She'd chosen an ibis because Grandma had once told her that it symbolized resilience. It was the last animal to take shelter before a hurricane and the first to reappear after the storm. No, not resilience, Mom had said, overhearing. Regeneration and wisdom. Danger, Louisa thought. Optimism. Dinner, Pepper added. Hunting ibises was illegal, but he'd grown up shooting them for the table and occasionally still brought one home. The meat was orange and fishy. Now, 1,000 miles away from him, Louisa stood alone in an empty classroom. She'd arrived early to secure a spot on the southern wall, and she was pleased with how her painting looked there, bathed in that diffuse northern light, what Mom called painterly light. One window was cracked to let in a breeze, but the room still smelled sharply of oils and turpentine. Afternoon sun gilded the floorboards. As Louisa's classmates arrived and hung their work, she turned to the wall and ran her fingers over the thumbtack holes. The other sophomores all knew one another already, had spent foundation year together, and in their presence, Louisa felt furiously shy. Maureen walked in, a manila folder under her arm. All professors went by their first names at RIN, which did nothing to make Maureen less formidable. Though her wardrobe consisted entirely of overlarge t-shirts and paint-stained cargo pants, the pockets full of jangly objects, she carried herself with the pugnacious confidence Louisa occasionally saw in certain older women who had stopped caring what the world thought of them. "Everyone ready?" said Maureen. She opened the folder. "We'll go alphabetically this time. Louisa Arsenex, you're up." "Arsenault," Louisa corrected her softly. "It's French." She shifted so she was standing next to her painting with her back to the wall. She hugged her sketchbook to her chest as her classmates, all 15 of them, gathered in a semicircle. Only Maureen brought a chair, its legs squeaking against the floor. She set it in front of Louisa's painting and sat down, crossing her arms. There was a long silence, her classmates' faces unreadable. Maureen wore bifocals, and she had a habit of tipping up her chin when appraising a painting, as though she were looking down on it. Finally, Jack Kulikia, who wore a baseball cap embroidered with "Eat the Rich," said, "My problem with your painting isn't that it's kitschy, exactly." He stood near the back, but he towered over everyone, his voice carrying clear across the room. He was known for his digital mashups of assassinated presidents and murdered rappers, the notorious JFK, Tupac Lincoln, Freaky McKinley. "My problem with it is that it screams, 'I'm from the South,' but it's like Southern Gothic light." Louisa bristled. She wasn't just from the South. She was from Acadiana. Expelled by the British from Nova Scotia, her Acadian ancestors had settled in the swamps of southeastern Louisiana before it was even a part of the United States. Pepper, who as a child had been beaten for speaking Cajun French at school, had served as an interpreter for American troops in France during World War II. She wasn't Southern, she was Cajun. Louisa flipped to a blank page in her sketchbook. She hunched over and wrote Southern Gothic light, slowly, in neat cursive. "What do we think about the formal elements?" said Maureen. Emma Ochoa, who made brooding canvases about being in a long-distance relationship, said something about the blue in the clouds, picking up the color of the bird's eye and giving the painting nice movement. Demir Erdem, who was Turkish and movie star handsome, smiled at Louisa and praised her use of red in the cypress bark. "Movement," Louisa wrote. "Cypress bark. Red. While making the painting, building the frame, stretching and gessoing and sanding the canvas, sketching out the composition, consulting her photos of Lake Martin, refining her lines with each iteration, Luisa had fallen in love with it. She'd seen what this painting might do, how it might make someone feel. She'd hoped to convey how intensely she experienced the landscape of her home, how heavily the air weighs, hinting at deluge and decay, how plants grow with such vigor that a cat's claw vine can crack a house's foundation. The brushwork is really accomplished, said Alejandro Diaz, who always wore the same pair of lace-up boots, which Luisa took to mean that he was probably also on scholarship. Say more about that, said Maureen. Like the texture of the paint on the surface of the canvas, the impasto, it's almost liquid, like stormy water, sort of a form follows content kind of thing. Impasto, Luisa wrote, frenzied. Good technique, said Karina Piantek, Luisa's roommate. Karina stood apart from the group, slouched against the wall. She had her long hair gathered up in both hands. She'd been braiding it as she listened to the crit. Now she dropped the braid, letting it unravel. But I feel like I've seen this painting before. Luisa wasn't sure how she'd ended up with Karina as a roommate. The other sophomores had singles, or else they roomed with friends. And Karina was wealthy. Her parents were art collectors, and the other day Luisa had sat behind her in lecture and seen her order a pair of $200 sunglasses. Surely she could have had her pick of housing. Luisa had decorated her side of the room with family photos and a Festival International 2009 poster from 2 years ago. Karina had hung only an oval mirror and a small canvas that evoked a squall at sea and seemed in its perfection less painted than conjured. Karina hadn't been mean to Luisa, but she hadn't been nice either. Each morning she woke at 7 and drew in bed for an hour, sketchbook propped against her knees. Her duvet was creamy white with thin threads of light blue, but she didn't seem to care about dirtying it. Luisa had admired this ritual and resolved to imitate it, but the other day when she'd pulled out her own sketchbook, Karina had looked over and lifted a single pale eyebrow. Wordlessly, Luisa got dressed and went to the common room, where instead of drawing, she spent an hour playing Angry Birds on her phone and brooding over whether her roommate liked her, which was stupid because she wanted to be a great artist, and great artists didn't care about people liking them. They were too busy disappearing into their work. Since that morning, Luisa continued to wake at the same time as Karina, but instead of drawing in bed, she fixed a mug of instant coffee in Hope Hall's kitchenette before walking to Williams Park, the bluff that overlooked the town of Stonewater, where she drew the skyline until her first class at 9. She skipped breakfast to save dining room credits. Her scholarship covered only the smallest meal plan, and put lots of milk and sugar in her coffee to compensate. Maureen gave Karina a sharp look. You've seen it before? Explain. The truth was, Luisa would have liked to draw Karina. She wore elegant, billowy clothing, wide-legged trousers and floor-grazing skirts, patterned shawls and complicated wraps. Her face had an austere, graven quality, like an old statue, and she had the most magnificent hair Luisa had ever seen, thick and silky, a sort of icy blonde. Once, Luisa dreamed that she'd cut it all off with her X-Acto knife while Karina slept. Another night, she dreamed about kissing her. It's the way I imagine an LA or New York artist might depict the South, said Karina. It's just a landscape. It's just a bird. What's it trying to do? What's it trying to say? You weren't supposed to talk while being critted. Just a bird, Luisa wrote. She thought about how Karina knew what she looked like first thing in the morning, or when she came back from her shift at the cafeteria, fingers pruned, smelling of dish soap. Crit was a different, more brutal kind of intimacy. If the painting's meaning could be expressed in words, why would she paint it? Said Ivy Morton. A foxtail always hung from her back pocket. Real or fake, Luisa couldn't tell. It's an accomplished painting, said Karina. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just reminding Luisa that art has to do something. In her sketchbook, Louisa wrote, "Do something," and drew a quick little doodle of an egret. Every artist had something they drew for reassurance. For her, it was birds. Mom was always doodling intricate little insects all over her gradebooks. She wondered what Maureen drew for comfort, what Karina drew. "What about self-expression?" said Ivy. "What about it?" said Karina. "What if the painting reflects an experience of Louisa's that you're not aware of?" Just because something is meaningful personally doesn't make it meaningful as art. It's like just because something actually happened doesn't make it a good story. Louisa wrote, "Meaningful?" under the egret. "Enough," said Maureen. "You're veering too theoretical. I'd like you to go back to discussing Louisa's painting now." Face burning, Louisa looked at her canvas for the first time since the crit had begun. She saw it now as Karina did. How was it possible to love something so much when you were alone with it, only to hate it as soon as other people saw it? Alejandro spoke. "I don't think the painting's about a bird. To me, it makes me really aware of time. I think it's about the moment before something terrible happens, the loneliness of being alone in that moment." Alejandro had delicate, almost pretty features and wore a gold chain that disappeared inside his shirt. Louisa wondered what hung on it. Something glib, a stranger's dog tags, or something sincere, like a crucifix. "Yes," said Maureen. "Maybe it's the contrast between the large, smooth areas in the sky and the active, textured water. It has this contradictory quality of both stillness and movement that Louisa executes well." She opened up the manila folder again. "All right, Jack Calicchia, you're up." They shuffled to the opposite side of the classroom where Jack had hung a piece titled "Still Life with Family," a dark, blurry painting in shades of ochre and burnt umber, where the only distinguishable objects were a pair of ashtrays, a broken mirror, and several pink pills. A few conflicting interpretations were proposed. Jack seemed pleased. Louisa hovered near the back of the semicircle and kept quiet. Then they moved on to Alejandro's painting, a hazy rendering of a deserted city bus stop at sunset, telephone wires crisscrossing a sky of pink and gold and ocean glow blue. "I have this theory," said Maureen, "that every male artist goes through a telephone wire phase." Louisa glanced at Alejandro in sympathy, but he betrayed no reaction. Karina went last. Her painting was a large, abstract piece that seemed to mute the paintings hanging alongside it. She was unafraid of bold colors, cursive loops of pink, pools of blue, slivers of black. To these glowing fields of color, she'd added bits of cloth, frills of lace, even embroidery. The result was a painting so lively it seemed to leap off the wall. It teased the eye, it took up space, it was unapologetic. It seemed to say, "All those aesthetic dogmas you old men spent your lives squabbling over, here they all are in bed together." Jack said something vaguely critical about the painting being self-consciously feminine, but it was largely admired. Karina absorbed the praise without expression, long arms folded over her chest. She didn't take notes. After class let out, Karina paused at the top of the painting building's steps to light a cigarette. As Louisa walked by, Karina called, "Hey, heading back to our room?" Louisa turned. "Yeah?" "I'll walk with you," Karina said, coming down the steps. "Okay," said Louisa wearily. They set off across the green. Students lounged in the grass with their sketchbooks and water bottles emblazoned with Rin's crest, an ornate W above the words pro arte utile, Latin for useful abilities. This motto was the subject of many jokes, but Louisa, who'd read up on the school's history, thought it made sense. It had been founded in the 1800s by early feminists who wanted women to apply the principles of art to trade and manufacture, to become economically self-sufficient. Now Rin was co-ed, and its students seemed less interested in trade and manufacture than in curating their aesthetic identities. Your identity, inseparable from your work, was what you'd sell when you went out into the world. "Do you have siblings?" Louisa asked Karina. She wasn't sure that she wanted to be friends with her roommate, but she'd been taught it was polite to ask people questions about themselves. No, it's just me. I'm an only child, too. I used to beg my mom for a sister. They passed under one of the stone archways. It was a lovely school, ivy, brick, a clock tower, paper pail houses converted into classrooms, a spare Puritan beauty, quaint as fuck, people said, though one often blighted by rogue installation artists erecting sculptures on the quads in the middle of the night. They were made of things like Legos and packing pellets and old furniture, but the administration let them stay till they fell apart. Louisa had applied because famous artists had studied here, people whose work hung in museums, whose names appeared in her art history readings. Sometimes she had to pinch herself. I am here. Did you have Maureen last year for painting? No, first semester we had Ellen Hong, and then we had Clark Strickland. How were they? Ellen was fine. Clark was kind of a dick. How so? Oh, he was just sexist. He'd encourage the girls to paint from life and the boys to do abstraction. Yikes, said Louisa, though what was wrong with painting from life? Old school macho bullshit, said Karina, exhaling a cloud of smoke. That was Clark's thing. They fell silent as they crossed Valence Street. Casting about for something to say, Louisa asked Karina what she'd done over the summer. I traveled a bit. Where'd you go? Karina tossed her cigarette into the street, then stopped in the middle of the sidewalk to light another. A few different places. Her gaze snagged on something over Louisa's shoulder. Louisa turned to see what it was. They were standing in front of the Rhin Museum, where a banner advertised a new exhibit by someone named Robert Berger. I know him, Karina said abruptly. Robert Berger? Karina nodded. Like, know him? Yeah. I've never heard of him. How did you meet? Through my mother, said Karina in a tone that invited no further questions. The rest of the walk passed in silence. When they got back to Hope Hall, Karina went to take a shower. Louisa was debating what to do. It was too early for dinner, but if she went to the cafeteria now, there'd be fewer people to see her eating by herself. When she noticed Karina's sketchbook peeking out from her bag, she hesitated, then furtively crossed the room and slipped it out, flipped through it quickly. God, Karina was talented. There were studies for future abstract paintings, sketches from their figure drawing class, some lustrous pastel work, and Louisa made a little noise of shock in the back of her throat. A drawing of Louisa's own face. In the drawing, her eyes were downcast, half closed, her lips parted in an expression of bliss or stupefaction. She wasn't sure she'd ever made such a face in her life. It was a beautiful drawing, intimate and violating. Down the hall, she heard the shower stop. She closed the sketchbook, stuck it back in Karina's bag, and went off to a dinner she was no longer hungry for.
We now have time for questions. I think we're a small enough group. If people speak loudly, and perhaps Antonia could repeat the question for the audience. So I'll get us started because I feel like that's the band-aid piece of this. I would love, I know you've spoken about this in the classes you've been at already, but thinking of, if you could talk some about your process of writing, how you begin, and especially I think talking about the role of revision for you as an author.
So the question was about my process, how I begin, and what role revision plays. So there are some writers out there who sit down, before they write a novel, they sit down and they outline the whole thing. I have a friend who does this. She puts up little different colored sticky notes on her walls. And they, after they're done, they kind of sit down and they just fill out the outline. And it's like magic. I'm very envious of those people because I am not one of them. When I sit down to write a novel, and I say that like I've written tons, I've written this one novel and I'm working on another. So in my experience so far with 1 1/4 books, when I begin, what I have in my mind are a setting, a couple of very vague, blurry characters, and some themes or ideas or questions that I want to explore. So my first drafts are very, very exploratory. They meander, they go off on tangents. Sometimes I'll introduce a character who completely disappears a few chapters later. But what I'm doing in those initial drafts is sort of figuring out what the story is. I need to tell myself the story before I can tell the story. Once I've finished a first draft, I have kind of a better idea of what it is that I'm doing. I'm not totally 100% certain of the direction that I'm going in, but I have a little bit of a better idea of where to focus. And at that point, I do a very, very loose outline based in part on what I've already written and in part on what I want to achieve in the next draft. And then I write a second draft, and I say that as though it's easy. It's really not. Like a second draft might take me, 6 or 7 or 8 months. But what I find is that the further I get into the process, the more I layer in. So my first few drafts often have plot holes. The characters aren't really fully fleshed out. The themes are not threaded together quite as tightly as they could be. But with every subsequent draft, I'm doing a couple things. I'm fixing things that I know are problems, and I'm layering in new elements. So in a lot of ways, the process is akin to painting in the sense that I'm starting with just these very kind of blurry outlines, blocks of color, and with every new draft, I'm layering in additional shapes and texture and color, so that the end product hopefully feels fully lived in or alive. But that's a process that for this book took me like 7 years to write. The book that I'm working on now, I've been working on for almost 3 years. It's not done. It probably won't be done for a while. So it's a very long, slow process. It involves, sometimes it involves false starts. It involves throwing away hundreds of pages of writing that either are not good enough or just not, serving the story and going off in the wrong direction. But all this to say, what I hope I'm conveying is that nobody sits down, unless they're superhuman, nobody sits down and bangs out a perfect novel in one draft. And if they do, I hate them. Like, how dare you? It takes so really the important work happens in revision. The first draft is really just the beginning. And that's something that I really struggled with as a younger writer, because I would write a first draft and I would get so attached to sentences as I had written them. And so I really had to teach myself to be ruthless with my work and throw away stuff that wasn't working and try again and again and again and again. And this particular novel took maybe 8 drafts. And that is not unusual. I've talked to many authors who's will do 10, 15 drafts of a book before it's published.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, I kept thinking how, I don't know what your research project process was like, because as I was reading this, I thought, well, there's so much about sort of the world of painting,
Mm-hmm.
right? About sort of contemporary art, or painting in particular. So it was fascinating for me to read that, but I also kept thinking about how the world is full of books about writers writing about writers. And so I was wondering if the process of you as an artist working in one medium, writing about artists working in another medium, if there was some sort of action going back and forth, if it was helping you think about sort of interplay between these two art forms was sort of productive in some way for writing a novel.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So I should say that I had a little bit of a secret weapon, and that I'm married to a painter. So I had someone to go to with all my questions, and I had someone to read my work and tell me if I was depicting it accurately. So I would show my husband drafts, and he would say, no, this is not how you would do it at all. Let me let me tell you how we painters do things. But I wanted to write. When I started out working on this book, I knew that I wanted to write a novel about creativity, and about creativity and ambition, and what it means to try and make a life as an artist, particularly under capitalism. But I did not want to write a book about writers, even though that's the world that I know best, and not because books about writers aren't good. There are so many fantastic books about writers. I love a book about a writer. But I was worried about making a mark in such a crowded genre, for starters. And I wanted to give myself a challenge about writing about a visual medium. I should say that I am not a particularly visual person. I don't really have a great imagination in 3D. I'm very, very verbal. So this was sort of a challenge to myself. Like, can I pull off writing a book about visual art that's still going to be compelling to someone who maybe has no interest in visual art? But what I found as I was writing this book is that, a lot of the ideas and anxieties and questions that the characters have as visual artists are identical to the ideas, questions, and anxieties that I have had as a writer. And after, this book has been out for a little over a year, and I've heard from artists working in other mediums, and very different mediums, who have told me that even though they are not painters, that the book has really resonated, because I do think that a lot of the questions and the ideas that it's exploring are kind of universal to anyone who has ever tried to do something creative, who's ever seriously embarked on a creative pursuit. Yeah.
I guess, were there any works of art or works that you've seen or read that influenced your process of creativity?
Yes. And in fact, one of the cool things so this is the paperback edition, which just came out in July, and the paperback actually has there's an author's note that lists some of the artists I was inspired by, and then my publisher added a little write-up that I did at the very end with specific artists who inspired me. A couple of artists are actually people I know personally. Some of these artists are dead. I have never met them. Some of them are very famous. I have also never met them. But the first two on the list, Kayla Zeek and Hannah Lutz Winkler, are both artists who I know personally, and whose work I have seen in person many times, who I've had the chance to talk to. And for me, it was a real pleasure to be able to use their work to have their work inform mine. And I remember I had not told them that I had been inspired by their work until I had sold the book, because I didn't want to be like, oh, I'm writing a novel, and for them to think like, oh, okay, yeah, whatever, that will never see the light of day. So I wrote them both, after I sold the book, I wrote them both a long letter that basically said, here's how your work inspired me, here are the relevant passages, I have credited you. And I was very nervous. I was like, are these people, they're not close friends, they're people that I know, but I wouldn't consider them like bosom buddies. And I was nervous that they were going to be upset. But they were both incredibly happy and enthusiastic. And in fact, Kayla participated in like a pre-publication campaign that my publisher did. So my publisher gave away prints of one of her paintings. So that was really cool for me to be able to point readers towards this artist who I really admire, whose work inspired plot lines in the book. Yes.
I have an interest in birds, so it didn't take long for me to get sucked into work with the first chapter with that image of the ibis. And it's just so beautiful, and I kept thinking, gosh, I wish I could actually see the painting that she's talking about. It's beautifully drawn in words. It's not just the image of the ibis, but you were talking also about what it symbolizes, the signification of the ibis. And so my question is about maybe the role of research in your work. I mean, I don't know if you already knew about what the ibis might symbolize in different cultures, or if you didn't, then, I mean, and it's not just about the ibis, maybe other things in the novel as well. How much do you find yourself sort of researching to bring more knowledge about that into the work?
Yeah, so I do a lot of research. I should say I love birds. I'm not a bird expert. So that particular piece of information just involved me Googling ibis and reading about ibises, like reading both about the species and their significance in various cultures. Research for me is very important, and for this particular book, it took different forms. Like I said, I'm married to a painter. My mother is an artist, so I had sort of two people in my life who I'm very close to, who I could go to with questions. But I also there were aspects of the world that I was writing about that I was really not familiar with. So like the particular economics of the art world, for example. So for that, I sought out books about that world. I read a lot of art criticism. I watched several documentaries, which are, and in fact, it's not a real bibliography, but I have an author's note at the end that lists some of the sources that I consulted. But a lot of it too just involved talking to people. So again, I am fortunate in that I have artists in my life who I could speak to. But one of the parts of my research was when I was in graduate school, I knew that I wanted to write a scene that was set at an art fair. And I applied for a grant from my graduate program for travel money, and I got them to pay for me to go to an art fair in New York. And my research essentially involved walking around all day and eavesdropping on people. And writing down just, I would just kind of lurk behind people and kind of listen into their conversations and then write down what they said. And it took a lot of photos. But that was, I know it sounds terrible, but that was a really important part of my research. I sort of needed to know, okay, how do really rich people who are considering dropping $500,000 on a painting, what are they talking about right before they make that decision? So something like that. That was an important research trip. I'm writing a book now that is about language and translation and bilingualism, among other things. So, and I'm not a linguist. I'm not an expert in linguistics in any way. So I've been reading a lot of books on linguistics and bilingualism. So for me, research often takes the form of just reading, seeking out scholarly sources, but also just seeking out books that have even just a very tangential relationship to what I'm writing about. And those books, you should see my bedside table right now. It's like piled very, very high with various different books. And if I took a picture of them all, oftentimes the titles will probably not seem like they have anything really to do with one another, but they do. I will pull things from all of them that do eventually come together and coalesce in my fiction. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for students or college age people who are thinking about maybe pursuing a career in like writing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the question is, do I have any advice for college-age students who are thinking about pursuing a career in writing? I have several pieces of advice. My first piece of advice, which is something that I probably would not have wanted to hear at your age. In fact, I know someone told me this, and I really didn't want to hear it, but it was important, and that is to not be in a hurry to publish. A lot of unless you are 1 in a million, which maybe you are, I have no idea. But unless you're 1 in a million, you're probably not going to be one of those people that publishes a book right out of college. They do exist. Zadie Smith is an example of one of those wonderkins. But most people need time and experience and lots of practice before they're ready to publish something. So right now, my advice to you is just write a lot, but don't write with an eye towards I'm going to publish this. Just write with an eye towards every single word that I write is helping me become a better writer. And most of what I write right now is probably not going to see the light of day. I'm probably going to put it away and never look at it again. But that doesn't mean that it's a waste. In fact, it's the opposite. Every piece of writing that you are doing right now is getting you closer to the work that you're eventually going to publish. So that's the first piece of advice. My second piece of advice is to, kind of cliche, but just read really widely. Read work in the genre that you are hoping to write in. So, if you are a poet, read lots of poetry. If your dream is to write a thriller, read lots of thrillers. But also read in genres that you maybe have no interest in writing in, or maybe you don't think are your cup of tea. So if you are not a poet, read poetry. Read nonfiction. Read journalism. Read experimental novels. Read really traditional murder mysteries. And when you're reading something that you're really enjoying, that's really gripping you, ask yourself what it is the writer is doing on the page that is making it so gripping, right? Is it the language? Is it the voice? Is it the way that the author is developing the characters? What is it that is making the work so compelling? And see if you can replicate that in your own work. And conversely, if you're reading something that is just not doing it for you, obviously feel free to chuck that book away and finish it. I don't believe in finishing books that you're not enjoying unless you're reading for class or for work, whatever. But before you do that, ask yourself, what is it that this author is doing that's not working for me? Why is this book not doing it for me? Is it because the characters are flat? Is it because there's too much summary and not enough scene? Is it because the dialogue feels clunky? Ask yourself what it is that the author is doing that is not working for you, and avoid that in your work. Work against that in your work. I think that you can learn as much from books that you hate as from books that you love. Another piece of advice, if you are thinking of going into an MFA, which I wholeheartedly recommend. I did an MFA. I loved it. It completely changed my life. First, only do an MFA if it's funded. So only do an MFA if you are getting paid to go. Never pay for an arts degree because it truly will never lead to a job, again, unless you're 1 in a million. And the other thing I would advise you is not to do it right after college. Graduating from college is really scary. And it can be really comforting to go straight into another academic program because it's what you know. And for some people, that's the right move. For some people, that's what they need. But I took 5 years off between college and graduate school, and I worked a job, and it wasn't a forever job, and it wasn't always fun. There was a lot of grind, but I learned a lot and I grew up a lot and I gathered experiences that then fed into my work. And I think it's really, really valuable to have that sort of real life experience on the world. And then another thing that teaches you is fitting writing in around a job. The vast majority of writers, even published writers, don't make a living from their work. They make some money, but for most people, writing alone is not enough to pay the bills. So it's really worth training yourself to write around your other source of income. And that's one of the things that, having a job, even if it's not your dream job, can teach you. Other questions?
I got poached twice. I've got research on how you develop your skills as a writer. So.
Is there anyone else? We have time for one more question.
Yes. I'm just wondering, you mentioned that you probably drafted 8 different times. Can you just tell us from the most basic first draft to, was it characters, was it story, how did it evolve, or what maybe switched within?
What evolved over the course of oh my God, so many things. There are characters who I got rid of. There are characters I added. So some really important characters did not appear until I was 3 or 4 drafts in. A lot of it was completely changing aspects of the plot, chopping off storylines, adding storylines, and then just a lot of sort of refining the language. So if you read my first drafts are unreadable by a human being. I don't really let anyone other than my husband read them because they would judge me forever. So a lot of the I need to make this sentence pretty happens in later drafts. So if you read a first draft next to a finished draft, you might think that they're by 2 different writers, just given the difference in the quality of the prose. Yes?
How was the revision process for this? Who did you go to and why? Was there any involvement with writing groups, or were you keeping it mostly to people you knew?
Yes, I was mostly giving drafts to people that I knew and trusted. So other writer friends. For the most part, my partner. I also took classes during the time that I was writing this book. So I took some fiction workshops in my community that were helpful. And then when I was in graduate school, I was showing the work to my cohort and also to professors. So there were always people. There were lots of people who read the book along the way. I think the tricky thing is you have to sort of find your readers, and not every piece of feedback is good feedback. And that's sort of one of the skills that every writer needs to learn is what feedback feels right to me, who are my readers, and which are the voices that I can kind of ignore because they don't really understand what I'm trying to do.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you again to Antonia.
Thank you.